Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I know some folks are still logging in right now. I am your host, Pamela Burdman, Executive Director of Just Equations. And if you know me, you know my hair is longer, a little longer than usual. As we are getting started, we just have a few instructions. When you'd like to ask a question, we're going to use the Q&A function. So if you have like a technical question, that you can use the chat, but for questions that you want us to answer during the webinar about the substance, please use the Q&A function, and we're going to get to as many as we can during the webinar. There will also be an opportunity for participants later to share experiences and challenges, including things that you're confronting now because of the pandemic. And note that we will make the webinar available on our website within a few days. So I don't see any key questions for anyone right now, so we're going to continue. I'm going to introduce our panelists. In addition to myself, we have Rogéair Purnell, who's the lead author of the report, Go Figure, that we're going to be discussing. Hi, Rogéair.
Hi, everyone.
Great to be partnering with Rogéair on this. And then we have two special guests. And what we're going to do is, after Rogéair and I provide an overview of the research, then we're going to engage in some discussion with our guests, My-Linh Nguyen, who's from Cuyamaca College in counseling, and Vikash Reddy, who is the Senior Director of Policy Research at the Campaign for College Opportunity. Hi, My-Linh, and hi, Vikash.
Hello.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Great. And then before we open, and then after that, we're going to open up to additional questions. But before we do that, we want to find out about all of you. So we have a quick poll to find out a little bit about who you all are. We'd appreciate your answering. It should be on your screen now. Okay. Are you guys seeing the results on your screens? Not yet? Okay. 92% of you have voted. So it looks like we've got about 28% of you are post-secondary math educators, 28% are K-12 math educators. We've got some education leaders, 20% advocates, 21% education leaders. I think only share results. There we go. Now can everyone see the results? Yep. So this is our audience that we're looking to speak with. So glad you're all here. Thank you. And one other question for you. This is not our first rodeo on Zoom. We actually do Zoom webinars somewhat regularly, and this is part of our series called The Architects of Math Opportunity. We have another poll that I'm trying to find. There we go. Just wondering, of the participants, if you've been part of our prior webinars. This is a very quick question. So we know about how many of you have been with us before. It looks like a lot of you are new, actually, but the poll isn't over yet. So let's hold on. Okay, almost everyone has voted. I know some of you have been to some of our other meetings. Okay, I'm about to close the voting here. Great. So for most of you, this is your first webinar with Just Equations. Fabulous. Thank you so much for joining us. especially since some of you are new to us. Just a few words about Just Equations, our sponsor and the organization that I founded 2 years ago. Our mission is to reconceptualize the role that's played by math in education equity. So math can and should have an important role in students' lives and their education to help students expand professional opportunity, understand and critique the world, and experience wonder, joy, and beauty. And I wish I'd written that, but that comes actually from the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. The problem is that access to these benefits is not equitable. And our goal at Just Equations is to challenge and ultimately change what we call the prevailing architecture of math opportunity. This architecture is grounded in misconceptions about what math learning is and who can learn math. Secondly, it's scaffolded by existing inequities, especially for students of color and low-income students, including access to resources and experiences like bias and stereotype threat. And lastly, it's reinforced by the way that we use math to confer pedigree, which really serves often to preserve privilege rather than to foster preparation. So as we look to shift this prevailing architecture, one of our focus areas is post-secondary mathematics. And our new report that was led by Rogéair, Go Figure, looks specifically at this area. So a little context for the report. As many of you know, research over the past decade confirmed that the traditional approaches to college remedial mathematics were actually doing a disservice to students, underplacing large numbers of students, especially students of color, into remedial sequences of up to 3 or 4 courses. These were sequences that repeated high school material that many of them had already mastered, or material that they actually did not need for their future endeavors. And we know that these long sequences served as a barrier to students actually completing college successfully. And that the algebra intensive content of these sequences was really pretty poorly aligned with many students' aspirations. As a result, these remedial math sequences, however well-intended, were not serving their purpose, and they were actually serving as a filter and exacerbating opportunity gaps, not serving as a foundation for student success. So that research gave rise to new policies, such as multiple measures placement, in which placement tests were not relied on solely, or sometimes not relied on at all, to determine which math courses students would be taking in college. Secondly, diversified math pathways, so that there wasn't just a single one-size-fits-all pathway through mathematics for all students, rather pathways aligned with students' goals, and co-requisite courses and other forms of just-in-time support, such that in the last decade, the remedial math course taking saw a large drop. The latest survey was actually 5 years ago, had a drop by 30%. We're quite confident it's dropped much farther in the meantime, based on what we're going to be talking about on the next slide. Also, a majority of colleges are using multiple measures placement and diversified math pathways. So it's been a major change in terms of how math placement and math course taking is taking place. Specifically in California, we've had 2 major policy changes. One, shown on the slide, the California community colleges fall under legislation called AB 705. And not shown on the slide, but parallel to this change, the CSU system has adopted 2 executive orders that have also changed the way students are placed in mathematics. In effect, these policies have meant that far fewer community college students, and effectively 0 CSU students, are now being placed into remedial math courses. More and more institutions are offering diverse pathways through mathematics in areas such as statistics and quantitative reasoning. And that brings us to our research question for Go Figure, which I'm going to have Rogéair share in a minute. But I would just want to say that what's key is that we're operating from this assumption that the long-term success of these diversified pathways requires equitable access to the pathways. And by that, I mean that access is not based solely, primarily, or really at all on student characteristics such as race and class. How do we know whether these diversified pathways and other approaches are ensuring equitable access to these math courses and the opportunities that the courses open up? How can we be sure that they aren't being used to reinforce inequities and track students, such as students of color, out of STEM pathways and other post-secondary opportunities? That's what we aimed to examine. So Rogéair led the study, and she's going to walk us through it now.
Great. Welcome, everyone. And just to add to Pam's point, obviously the impetus for these math reforms is to ensure that there isn't inequity, that this is a chance to address and provide, address opportunity gaps to make sure every student is successful. But in conversations and spaces with higher education leaders, there was this concern, yes, this sounds great, but let's be sure that we're not repeating history, and math is seen as a way to track students out of STEM and more lucrative fields. And so we were kind of in attending different meetings, and this kept coming up, and so that kind of led us to launch this study. Let me tell you a little bit about the methodology. Next slide. So we started off with the literature review that Pam has touched on some of the key points. We also interviewed faculty, administrators, a director of a tutoring center, and then we led student focus groups. And so these were held at College of Alameda, LA Pierce, and Sac State. And we really looked for colleges that had kind of launched maybe a bit early or had been talking about the math reforms that they had put in place in response to the executive order or AB 705. We wanted colleges that were very diverse in terms of their student body, and we focused on race and ethnicity, and really wanted those that had clear STEM and non-STEM pathways available to students. So the participants for this, I just mentioned the colleges there, again, College of Alameda, LA Pierce, and Sac State. We talked to many administrators and faculty just to get a sense of how they had implemented the reforms and their sense of how things were going. And then we had a chance, and this was my favorite part always, is to talk with students in 4 focus groups that we held. And they were mainly students of color, and most of them were planning to transfer. Sorry, my dog has just arrived home from a walk. And most of them are planning to pursue STEM, B-STEM, which what we mean here is business, science, technology, engineering, and math fields. Now that may be, because we reached out to our math chair and some faculty, and many of them were teaching pre-calculus, and so they probably had ready access to B-STEM majors. The other was that I think too that although we didn't test this, students in a B-STEM pathway may be more confident in their math ability and more willing to talk about their math progress. And so that may be why we recruited those students. And students were majoring in a number of different fields, everything from art, biology, engineering, kinesiology, to social work and Spanish. So we had quite a range. So the overarching findings. So there were 5 key things that we walked away with. Students are using all of the information you are providing if you're on a college campus. They're using flyers and posters, they're going online. We'll talk about this more, when they're looking at Rate My Professor, they're looking at the catalog. They're really trying hard to figure out what is the best math class to take and what's the best math pathway for me to pursue given my interest. The other is that students, when they have a field of study already picked out or a major, this is easier. It makes sense, right? If they're undecided, it's more difficult to figure out, okay, should I pursue SLAM, which is statistics or liberal arts math, or should I do BSTEM, which is business and STEM? We know what those things mean, but for students, it may be difficult to kind of tease all of that out. So there was a recommendation from students that maybe more counseling time is needed for those students that are undecided to help them do some of that exploration so they can make the best choice. The third key finding is that math anxiety is real. Students really felt sometimes hampered or almost paralyzed in making a decision about what math course to take, regardless of their self-placement results, as an example. We're thinking about what many community colleges have implemented, because they just weren't confident that they could do well. And so counselors talked about that, students talked about that, and I'll give you an example of a student that was in that place and what she decided to do. And then students really are appreciative of the additional tutoring, the support courses, some of the intentional strategies the colleges are using to help them be successful in math. And from what we heard from students, they are being very successful. And then the last is that the classroom environment is key. Students talked about classroom environments where it was just like, okay, we're here to learn math, get out your book, here's the problem, we're gonna work through it. Really nothing that was culturally competent, student-centered, nothing that really allowed students to work together to solve problems. But students really appreciated instructors that took the extra time to get to know them and to think about how to present the material in a way that spoke to them. So I'll talk a little bit about that too when we discuss intentional strategies. So the first kind of sub-research question we had for students was really just to find out, how do you get information? I mean, what information did you use to figure out what math course to take or what math pathway to pursue? So the key things that students mentioned were materials. So it could be in a poster or flyer that they were given. The website was huge, and obviously now many students are getting information. That's the main way students are getting information. And Pam and I have been reviewing websites, and yes, it's sometimes difficult to figure out what to do with the information. Counselors also obviously were very important to students, particularly those that were dedicated to a special program like MESA, Math, Engineering, Science Achievement, given their particular knowledge on STEM pathways. And then online tools, most notably assist.org was used by many students. So I want to give you, I'm just going to have a hand put up the quote. Yes.
Mention what assist.org is, Rogéair.
Yeah, so students can go on and see the classes they might need if they want to transfer to a particular institution. So students are using it to build out their ed plans. And for example, for many of the engineering students, they may have 2 or 3 colleges that they were considering as transfer destinations, and so the requirements might differ. And so that's where Assist.org came on and was very helpful to them.
Okay.
So here's an example of a student, and this was a student who had shared that they were an engineering major, a young man of color, and he found out later on that he had been directed to take statistics, and he really needed to take pre-calculus given his major. And so, you know, it was hard to decipher, well, did the counselor have the information that she needed to let you know what course to take? Did you ask the right question? Did you provide the information that she needed to let you know what would be the most appropriate class? Or was there some sort of implicit bias here, right? We don't really know, but students often said, there's so much going on, and they understood there's a lot of things that are changing and things that are moving. So this student took it upon himself to use assist.org to develop his ed plan, and then found that he would take that to counselors to have them double check it for him, and then maybe even may talk to a peer to make sure that, hey, you're pursuing a similar pathway. Does this look right to you, right? So students are really trying to pull together a lot of information to make sure that they are not taking classes they don't need, and that they're taking class that's going to help them advance. The next sub-question was around agency. I really wanted to figure out if students had the information they needed to make an informed choice about their math courses or math pathway. And so students were often talked about, or the college's administrators talked about, having guided self-placement guidelines. Obviously assist.org I mentioned. Students often talk to peers. And they also use Rate My Professor, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in addition to meeting with counselors and to double check and to find out to develop that comprehensive ed plan. So I'm just going to share with you another quote from a student here. And this one is for a student who talked about using Rate My Professor. And what's interesting here is the student was really honing in on those instructors that were supportive of students. That was very important to them. So important that they doubled up on classes one semester until they could get those instructors that other students said were really helpful and help students be successful or concerned with student success. So just to show you that, yes, students used the information and made the decision, which good or bad, decided to take a couple classes just so they could get those instructors that they needed in one particular semester. The next quote is from a student, and this came up in talking with counselors and other students, that many times the guided self-placement process told a student, hey, you could take calculus, right? But the students are like, I don't know. This math anxiety thing, as I said, is truly real. And students decided to spend, hey, I'll spend another semester. I want to start in pre-calculus, and then I'll see if I can do calculus. And the student, it didn't set them back. But counselors sometimes spoke of, oh, I know this student could do it with taking the co-rec or the support course. But some students just decided, you know what, I'm just going to take the lower level course because I feel better about that. I feel more secure about that. So I want to stop here.
We're gonna, now we're going to, we have My-Linh here from Cuyamaca College, who is actually in the counseling department and works to counsel students. And we'd like to hear, before we go on, from some of her thoughts about what we've shared so far.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Again, I'm at Cuyamaca College, and I actually worked really closely with our math department chair, Tammy Marshall at Cuyamaca, through the past couple of years, rolling out AB 705 and things like that. So I participated heavily with this transition on our campus. And I wanted to speak a little bit just about the undecided student. We, see a substantial amount of students who do come in, they're undecided. And when we had the old remedial math sequence, students had some leeway to figure out what they wanted to do and study before actually getting on a math pathway. But now it's like students start college and they're starting right where the math pathways fork. And so it kind of ties in with our work with guided pathways and this notion of career planning before ed planning is needed, so that we can help kind of alleviate students from taking the wrong math in that first semester. I know counselors similar to myself would rather actually suggest that a student table math in the first semester sometimes if they're really unsure and undecided, just so that we can have a little bit more time to guide them onto the correct math pathway. So it ties into that need you guys mentioned of having more time for the student to explore, but let alone more time, with them in our offices. I feel that, oftentimes new students come into our campus and they come in on a drop-in basis, and that's 15 minutes. It's so fast, so fast for me to tell you what to do in 15 minutes. And so it really is about a couple of things with just having enough time with the students. One is that they, the notion is that they come into the office, they hop in on in the queue, and they want to see a counselor for 15 minutes and please tell me what to take this next semester. And it's just not enough time to meet with the student. And on the flip side, how do we get the students to kind of change that mindset that, maybe I should make a counseling appointment and actually sit with the counselor for 45 minutes and do a more comprehensive plan, whether or not I know what I want to do for my entire time here, but maybe I can at least, more thoroughly talk about what to do for the next year. So that's something that we've been working on, on our campuses, is trying to change the culture and campaigning students to really come in for more comprehensive ed planning. But we, at least I know my campus at Cuyamaca, we've come up on some roadblocks with just resources, just having enough resources, the manpower to see all the students. So even if we had everybody come in for, these longer appointment times, do we have enough people to see them? So that's one thing that we're definitely working on.
Well, thank you, My-Linh. And My-Linh is on. I want to say, please be sure to send in any questions you have on the Q&A for any of us. I'm sure My-Linh would be happy to answer any questions that are coming in as well. We did have one question about assist.org, and I wanted to clarify that is a California website. It wouldn't be useful for students in other states. It applies to transfer to the UC and the CSU systems.
Right. It doesn't include the private universities in California either. So.
Right. So thank you for that question that enabled us to clarify that. Now, Vikash also had some things to explore. You want to?
Thank you. So I think one of the things when I hear about students consuming data and that I kind of wonder about, so we talk about students as savvy consumers with the Rate My Professor, and I'm wondering, are they looking just for the 5-star professor, or are they combing through reviews and saying this professor does X or Y? And I think part of the reason I asked that is, are there implications for professional development, or things we can take away on the instructional side as well as sort of the counseling side?
So definitely are savvy consumers. It's like when you want to try out a new restaurant and you go to Yelp and you kind of read through and the 1-star rating of someone who went to the Italian restaurant and there was no gluten-free options. Sorry, Pam. You kind of push that aside and you really look through and see, look at the other assessments and make your decision. And that's what students are doing. So they're not just looking at the 4.5 or 5-star professors only and only picking them, but really reading through the comments, resonating with students who are like them and saying, oh, this student is like me, they didn't like math, and this professor really inspired them and really helped them. That's the instructor that I'm going to go after. And they also talked about, and I'll save my comments to talk a little bit more about intentional strategies. That's the next big question we had about ways faculty had helped students feel comfortable and to create that safe and welcoming environment in their classrooms. That's another important piece and things that students look for as well.
Got it. And then the second thing that kind of comes to mind, just so listening to stories about students who say, well, I don't think I can do this, or I'm not confident, the sort of the math anxiety, and thinking about some of the behavioral nudge work around, students like you do this, students who have taken X in high school, take this class and pass it, routinely. Are there ways, and maybe My-Linh, this is for you also, in terms of the way that we're, messaging to students, have we drawn on kind of that literature and that sort of set of strategies?
So maybe I'll start, and then Rogéair and My-Linh can jump in. What I would say is I think we're still learning how to do that effectively. And one misplaced message can undo all of the good intentions that you're talking about. For example, if a college still has some old language on their website that's very kind of deficit oriented and makes and compliance oriented, like you have to jump through all these hoops to prove that you're proficient in mathematics, that can undo a lot of the good intentions we speculate. I mean, that's part of what we are going to be looking into. But there is pretty solid research out of USC, Tatiana Malguiso's team there, that does show that under self-placement type mechanisms, that some students, especially students of color, and in some of the studies women, were more likely to underestimate their abilities compared to what their backgrounds suggest their abilities actually are. So we really need to understand more about what messages can sort of overcome that problem, if you will. Yeah. But Rogéair, I think you wanted to say something more on that.
No, I'll let My-Linh, because I'll cover some of that in my next
Okay, great.
part.
Oh, I was just gonna, I agree with the underplacing of students. So we see a lot of students come in, and same thing with the math anxiety, you know, they place at a certain level with our new placement questionnaire, and they're just like, oh no, I don't think I can, like, I'm not ready, or I don't like math. And so that really, it just requires a lot more, I think, dialogue that we need to have with the students. I feel now that students are self-placing because they go and they kind of, you know, go through this questionnaire, and then it kind of shoots out this recommendation that we need to, at least for our campus, I'd like to see more students come in and have a conversation and a dialogue after that, because it doesn't capture the students who are exploring other things that could be in a different pathway. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to go to the third research question here.
And this has to do with intentional strategy. How are the colleges and the faculty working to ensure that students are getting the skills that they need, particularly those students who, as we just discussed, may have come in and said, oh, I'm not a strong math student, I don't like math, I'm not sure about math. And we found there are a number of different ways the colleges were working to support students. Summer bridge programs, large scale expansion in sections of entry, kind of college entry level courses, many of them with co-recs, or what I mean, a support course, kind of a lab, a 2-unit lab that was added on to the end of the core course to allow additional time to work through subject matter. Tutoring of training. Even one college had a whole community of practice with their tutors, where they meet regularly and review data and made decisions about how to offer additional support to students. Supplemental instruction, most often embedded tutors, so tutors that are in the classroom that work with the instructor around the assignments, and then kind of help students with various questions and problems. Proactive advising was another, where, you know, if a student is struggling, a faculty person or a counselor would reach out to that student and say, I see that you're struggling, kind of based on what I can see in Starfish or what other software they may be using. The other thing was in the classroom, maybe having community agreements, how I had one instructor that allowed students to some degree to make decisions about what percentage of their grade would be quizzes or group activities or homework and things of that nature. I mentioned curriculum, and it's really important for students to have word problems or examples, things that would help them in their daily life or were relevant to their daily life or to what their interest, you know, in the world. And so one instructor talked about learning that he had a number of students that were in a particular field. So not all of his examples, but many of his examples were relevant for those students that were pursuing that major. Another instructor had students go out and interview folks like them that looked like them, had similar backgrounds as they did, that were pursuing a field or in a job that they were interested in, to learn more about their journey as part of the math class, so students could understand that you too can pursue this, and that means you too can be successful in math. Other instructors used a number of online resources. So Khan Academy came up, something called Upswing was another. And then also just videotaping themselves, the instructors completing problems and putting them on YouTube so students could access them was another example. And then the other was instructors having office hours at tutoring centers was another, just so that kind of the instructors there, and you can work with them on any problems that you might have. And I just share with you this quote. And this is from a student who, it was recommended to her based on her self-placement score that she take the the pre-calculus with the support course. And she really appreciated that because there was concern that students would be like a 6-unit math course. Whoa, you know, the core course being 4 units, for example, and then the lab being 2 units. But she actually really appreciated the extra time. And this was an instructor that was very intentional about how the classroom space was used. Students did a lot of small group work. They were graded on the effort that each put in to solve the problem. So even if the problem wasn't absolutely correct, showing their steps and everybody contributing was really key. Also the fact that this kind of built a support network among students where they started to work outside of class to help each other and could depend on each other. Like, hey, you seem to understand that. Can you help me with that? And so it kind of created that environment as well. And then this instructor was very sensitive to this issue of math anxiety. And so he would tell students like, okay, we're gonna talk about the Pythagorean theorem today, but where are their pyramids, right? There are pyramids in places where we're from, where you're from. You know, you're a natural mathematician, right? And he would use examples such as that to make students feel like, hey, I could do this. I can be successful in this. And then was very sensitive to, again, assignments that resonated with students. Like he understood that students loved rap music in the class. And so had them do, and I have to ask him to get the details, but have them use math to think about the rhythms and the songs and things like that. So students really, that resonated with students. They really appreciated that.
So Rogéair, so before you go on, we had a question come in about it kind of ties together the placement issues and some of these intentional strategies issues. So it says, when students self-place, are the students aware of resources other than the teacher? Are they aware of tutoring or student support centers, for example, that would be available to support them if they did enroll in the, you know, the highest course that they're eligible to take?
In many cases, and you probably could speak to this too, Pam, in our recent review of a number of websites, it seems like a lot of students were aware of the math lab or the tutoring center. So a lot of students were aware of that. In some cases, students didn't really go until they was part of the class. In one class, they talked about the tutor that was in the class or assigned to their class also worked at the math lab. And so they were more likely to go to the math lab knowing that that tutor that they already had the relationship would be there. Also in talking with on another project with a faculty person, they were finding that yes, we're doing embedded tutoring, and we're finding that that's just sort of successful, but we find that students in those courses that go see the embedded tutor at the math lab are tending to do better than other students that don't. So it sounds like students are aware of the resources, but in some cases they may be a little hesitant to go if there's not a relationship there. And so in some classes, they're giving students credit or helping to build a relationship with a tutor or the tutoring center as part of their class content.
So it's not necessarily influencing their decision in terms of what course they're going to take?
No, I didn't see that. And maybe that's a question for us to ask in the next round of research
Yeah, I think that's a good one.
Yes, great.
Okay, so now you want to go on to the some early findings?
Yeah, and I guess there will be a little asterisk by these early findings, right? And this is from College Alameda, and so they just looked at their courses in Intro to Stats pre-AB 705 before the math reform started, and you can see here there's obviously an opportunity gap, right? Where you have some groups of students, African American, Latinx students that aren't doing as well in the course. And then so they looked at it after their first semester of doing this work, and they were seeing that there's, you know, this opportunity gap is much narrower now, right? And I have to say, I was really excited about what we might see for this semester. Obviously, the world has changed and things have changed. So we'll see what happens. I understand in talking with a number of faculty members, they're finding that a lot of students are taking what's called, I think, an EW, if they decide that the online course is not for them. Obviously, we know a lot of students never wanted to take online math, had really wanted to be in that class with, working in small groups with the instructor and support and the embedded tutor support. And so, no, it's very difficult. It's very different now. And so we'll have to see what we learn, but what the data tells us this semester. But I'm a little worried that the opportunity gaps that we noticed on the previous slide probably will have returned. So the college, the students had some advice for the college. We touched on, and that having a longer period of time to meet with a counselor would be very helpful, just to work through some of these things and ask questions and explore a little bit, particularly for the students that were undecided about what might be the best math course and pathway to take. And also, I think, to share with students what the data might suggest, or that students like themselves that have taken the support course have expressed that they've done well and that it was helpful. I think the also is to help faculty, because I think a lot of the struggle and some of the fear around this is, I don't really know how to do this well. How do you work with students that are now in a college level course, and some of them are ready to advance on to the next concept, and then you have other students that really need some help with just the fundamentals. And so how do I manage that in the same classroom? And then the other is to help give instructors ways that they can kind of engage students, culturally competent ways to design the pedagogy. How do you take examples that are relevant to students' fields of study and what's happening in their lives? How do you help them work together and build connection? And how do you address math anxiety? In the web review, I actually found a college that's offering a class around math anxiety, help students address it, right? And then expanded tutoring. There just didn't seem to be enough tutoring. And we had one campus, I think it was Sac State, that had kind of these stats workshops where they would drop in rolling workshops throughout the day, where students as a group could come in for 30 minutes and meet with the tutor who was known to be the stats guru. I think it was called the House of Stats. And students knew they could drop in during those times and work with that particular tutor, who also then talked with the stats instructors to see, what are students struggling with? What should I cover in the House of Stats this week? And so, students really appreciated that, but just having to think out of the box, realizing that we may not have enough tutors for everyone. So how can we offer tutoring in a different way? And obviously a lot of colleges are going online now with tutoring and figuring out how to do that well. And then also students really appreciated when an instructor realized, hey, you're struggling. Let me make sure that you get the support that you need, all right? Or let me think of a different way to share this information, to see if this resonates with you and you understand it. So students weren't put off by that, obviously depending on how it was done, but really appreciated when a counselor or a faculty person said to them, it looks like you may need some additional support. Let's figure out what we can do to make sure you're successful.
Great. Well, now we wanted to tap all of you to think about some current issues that we're confronting. Vikash actually has a question that we'd like to ask all of you to respond to. And then after that, we also have a question that came in from a participant, Linda Smith, that we'd also like to share and open up to hear your answers. So go ahead, Vikash.
Yeah, thanks, Pam. So I think the sort of the synthesis of the question is on the screen, but I think just to kind of explain where I'm coming from, we've got this incredible moment, incredible for not the right reasons, but a moment nonetheless, that has forced us to really rethink certain structures on a short-term basis. And I think there are things that we've done away with, and barriers that we've removed that I'm wondering, moving forward, what do we sort of keep eliminated, as it were? And then what have we instituted in the last few weeks to a few months at this point that we think might be beneficial going forward? And so, one of the things that I sort of wonder about is virtual counseling sessions. could we use Zoom to do counseling sessions, and that might be a way to reach students who otherwise weren't able to get to the physical location. Obviously, it won't work well for all students, right? We wouldn't want to transition all counseling to Zoom, but maybe that's a tool that counseling offices and departments and can use to start reaching, right? And so in that vein, what are the things maybe that we're thinking about and instituting that we should have had all along, or that we should have going forward? So yeah, and maybe the panelists could kick it off while folks are thinking about it and tapping out some
Yes,
thoughts.
please. We're going to ask you to use chat for this because we're hoping we'll get a number of responses. So if you can use the chat to say anything you're doing, a change you've made that your college campus or one that you know of has made, that should be
I
continued.
can kick
Go ahead.
off.
Yeah.
I can kick off on this while people are thinking. At Cuyamaca, we started actually the Zoom counseling appointments last year, really, really small. And that was really just to serve students who purely were online, or the students who are working full time and can't get in during our office hours. But it was really, really small, not even advertised at the time, because and only I think 3 counselors were trained to do it. But since then, clearly everybody's now trained to provide counseling services through Zoom remotely. So that's been nice, at least for us, to kick that kind of like speed training and get everybody on board to be able to provide that type of service. But actually this is just this week even, we have 2 new things coming into play that I hope would remain after things go back to the new normal. One being that we've moved from a 45-minute counseling appointment to 60. And so that's a huge thing for us. We were asking for it for quite some time, but it's difficult with our limited resources. But now that we're in this atmosphere of working online from home and having to use VPN just to access our desktop, we've needed more time. We've also found that we spend a lot of time at the beginning just checking in with students on how they're doing out there, and dealing with their own personal things. So there is a lot of that time that we need at the beginning to reach out to the student before we get into our usual planning and things like that. So having that additional time is going to be amazing. I already know. So I'm hoping that we can kind of stick with that and show people that by having the long appointment time, students are walking away with more of what they need. And so that's one. And the second thing that we are kicking off this week is online appointment booking, which is huge for us as well, because hopefully in the next couple of days, students will be able to log onto our website and then just make their appointments with us online. So they can book their own appointments. So that's going to be really exciting, instead of, what we had before was students would have to call. They're calling it at 8. Anything 2 weeks from now, and it's like you're trying to call into a radio station to win something, and it's so I'm hoping that will help the students have more access to us, and I'm excited to see how that works for us over, I guess, the next couple months. And that, I think, that's definitely for sure something that's going to stay.
So great. A couple other things that are coming in. One math department is thinking of ways, always having at least one section of each course available online. So students who need to be online for a semester can continue their math pathway. That depending on the college, that may need to be more than one section, but we're going to see how that all evolves. That was from Andrew Ross. Melody Baker talked about peer support groups in addition to the one-on-one Zoom sessions. Let's see, we heard from Ken Sori. That we do a good job providing instructional coaches in K-12, particularly in math. It seems like it's time, particularly since we're having to adapt to new technology-based teaching tools, to have instructional coaches for all faculty, but in particular for adjuncts. Sounds like a good idea to me. Any comments on that from panelists?
I mean, I think one of the great ironies that's always struck me about sort of higher education is, so I got a PhD in education policy, but then never in that process was I taught how to teach. I dare say that's somewhat generalizable to other disciplines. And so, yeah, I think, my former advisor, Aaron Pallas, and his wife, Anna Newman, have actually written about teaching in higher education, and have made similar notes that, we're not taught how to teach folks who tend to go into the sort of higher ed to teach. So yeah, I think that's a fair observation from, who was it, from Ken?
That was from Ken Sori, and we've gotten some more approval of that idea from others. Joe Fiedler from CSU mentions that we don't pay adjuncts enough to add work, and I think that's fair. I think we would have to pay them for this kind of training, or somehow they would need some sort of compensation for that. Another one is the adjustments that instructors are having to make to assessment. Students are not being assessed in a room with proctors and all sorts of things. So that means thinking about, this is from Judy Kish at SF State. She didn't provide more details, but I think, it's a different environment. First of all, there's some amount of honor system. And secondly, the kind of question that you might be asking a student on an assessment that they're doing at home might be different. You might have to be more thoughtful about how to really assess what a student is learning. And also, can they use a calculator? Which may not be a problem in a lot of math courses, but yeah, still getting more votes for best practices for college instructors. So we had one more question that came in from Linda Smith, actually. And I thought we could actually open this up also for everyone, because there are many of you there who might be better at answering this than some of the panelists. But the question is, school districts, at least anecdotally, are seeming to be preparing massive remedial approaches to content that students may be missing during these recent school closures. And some of the approaches sound like what in higher education is sometimes called drill and kill, weeks upon weeks of review before introducing new content, and therefore sacrificing, arts and other opportunities to double up on math and English. And she says, I'm worried about the deficit thinking and how it will further impact student identity, agency, as well as opportunity gaps in mathematics. Any further thoughts? Any thoughts about the messaging on that? And I'd like to see if any of you have any kinds of input, but I just will say that we increasingly know a lot. Vikash, maybe you can comment about what we know about remedial mathematics from all the research that has been done at the higher education level. We know that traditional remediation hasn't been helping students. Do you want to say more about how that might apply to what K-12 should do?
Oh, that's a tough one. I mean, I think that is, the premise there is right, that these sort of, the just-in-time, the co-requisite remediation is much more, or sort of, skill building is much more effective at helping students, right? So to make sure that you're teaching the skill that is required as it's then going to be applied, right? You can just sort of reinforce things. And so this kind of like, let's go back and redo all of these things. Well, if it wasn't done effectively in the first place, redoing a similar curriculum probably won't work. And so really try to think about, right? And so I don't know, it's maybe a slightly different question on the K-12 level, but it still doesn't strike me as the right way to move forward. I think I will acknowledge also, as I say these things, that teachers are especially in the next couple of school years, facing gargantuan tasks, right? And I think We have always asked a lot of our educators, K-12 and higher ed, where that job is getting tougher. And so as I say these things about how, these are probably the more effective strategies, I acknowledge that they're more labor intensive and academically intensive. And so, Godspeed to the teachers, because you're doing God's work here. But I think this let's hold all students back approach isn't going to work, right? It hasn't worked in any of the other settings where we've tried it at local levels. Why would it scale to the system level? And so I think to the concern that Linda expressed in the question, I think that's a concern for sure. And hopefully district leaders are looking at the strategies that have worked, which are the ones that seem to want to provide these things concurrently and as a co-requisite fashion.
So that's very, very interesting. I'm thinking myself as a parent of a 5th grader who is learning mathematics and all the other subjects, of course. But I'm thinking, they're doing multiplication now, and I really do wonder if, on the positive side, there's various ways to do double-digit multiplication, which the traditional algorithm that most of us learn being only one of them, and perhaps not. It's the most efficient, but it's not necessarily the most intuitive for many students, including my daughter. I'm just wondering if this new situation could allow math instructors to rethink the emphasis to put on these different types of skills. It is really a big question. I see Melody is also saying, Melody Baker, this is the perfect time to rethink our approaches to diversifying math pathways and thinking about the most important things about math to teach, which is similar to what I was saying. We too often focus on what is most difficult opposed to what is most important. Thank you for saying that, Melody. I think that resonates with some of the work that our organization, Just Equations, has been doing. And also we hear from Courtney Ortega. Oh, she has to leave. We don't have to discuss that. But we also had a question about the exit of achieve.org and the need for more support for high school counselors in guiding students in their math journey to college courses, and how we fill that gap, which is something I'm sure Just Equations will be in conversations about how to do that. Let's see, I think we're going to move on. Well, we've been actually doing questions. I think I see some people have to leave at noon, so I'm going to take one more suggestion here from Karen Mayfield Ingram, and then Rogéair's going to, or actually I'm going to talk briefly about our next steps with this research. Karen is noting that it could be an opportunity to focus on who those students are in K-12 and tapping into family and community resources and learnings during this time. To do this, we need to learn more about our students and their lives. Karen, I hope you'll be sharing more resources about how to do that. Karen has some expertise around that. And Andrew Ross mentions, in terms of narrowing the standards, to look at NCTM's Catalyzing Change document, which I also highly recommend. And before we wrap up, I'm just going to note Just Equations is pursuing future research related to this topic, and we're going to need to be adapting that to our pandemic environment, of course. But we are examining, what kinds of courses are available to students and in what formats. How can we ensure that all these courses are bridges and not dead ends? As we already discussed, what kind of strategies really support students making optimal choices in their majors and their math pathways, and the type of professional development that's also we've been talking about to help counselors and faculty dislodge harmful preconceptions about students and their abilities, and particularly how to do that in this online format. So we welcome, we'll leave the Q&A on the chat on for a few minutes because we welcome any suggestions you have about future research you'd like to see from us or our partners. Thank you all so much for participating. I want to thank our special guests, My-Linh and Vikash, for making this a richer conversation. Many thanks to Rogéair for engaging with just equations and leading this important research. And also not pictured, but I want to thank Jennifer Bavard, our project manager, for setting up this webinar so we could all gather today on Zoom. Thank you so much. Please send in any comments or questions you have on the Zoom, but I see a lot of people are having to sign off at noon. So I think we're gonna end the formal presentation now. So thank you all very much. And we look forward to seeing everyone on a future webinar. Also, if you have a suggestion for a webinar topic, feel free to send that along as well. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, folks.
Bye-bye. So I'm going to, okay. Okay.